Hello. We'll wait to see if Kev finds me. I was found. Welcome, Marcus. Hello, everyone. Well, I think this is the biggest raid I've had so far, so woohoo. We have three to talk. Oh, Wayward Darling, welcome in. Right, this is going to be fun. It's all British, by the way. We're going to get enough of the election stuff from Kev tomorrow and lots of other people, obviously. So, likers, hello. Oh, this is going to be amazing. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Oi, oi. Hello, Kev. Welcome, my man. Okay, fuck it. Why not start with, God, Robert Jenrick. Get him over now, over and done with to begin with. Should be fun. Okay, this is from Turn Left. So, yesterday, this might have been Friday or Saturday. Oh, Rohack, hello. And Main Captain, hello. Wow, look at all the emotes. I'm going to love this. Right, to Bobby J we go.
Robert Jenrick says those who are colonised should be thanking Britain. He posted this on Twitter. I'm not ashamed of our history. And then with the post, he added an image, Daily Mail exclusive. Britain's former colonies should be thanking us for the legacy of the empire and not demanding slavery reparations. He also linked to an article he wrote in the...
That's quite a take. Don't get me wrong, we are where we are because of empire and the British state being utter bastards for centuries, essentially. But I'm not going to agree with you there, Robert. Sorry.
Daily Mail. Many of Britain's former colonies owe us a debt of gratitude for the inheritance we left them. So Keir Starmer spent the weekend doing what he does best, capitulating to those determined to tear our country down. After 48 hours of pressure to start a conversation on paying reparations to Commonwealth countries for the slave trade, he U-turned on his position and capitulated. As if that was not bad enough, Labour MPs attacked him for having a colonial mindset because he has not already forked out billions of taxpayers' money. Just over 100 days into this government, Labour are cooking up ways to send our money overseas while they slash winter fuel payments for pensioners on as little as £13,000. But this weakness points to a wider confusion in our society, the bizarre, unpatriotic belief that we should be embarrassed about our history. It has seeped into our national debate through universities, overrun by leftists peddling pseudo-Marxist gibberish to impressionable undergraduates.
Oh, not that Bollocks again. That doesn't happen. There are very few, if vanishingly rare, Marxists in universities and colleges. Right? I was lucky enough to have a socialist as a teacher when I was growing up in secondary, and he was one. There was only one of them. And there was none when I was doing my degree, none whatsoever. Mind you, I was in science, so there were scientists, essentially, biologists and geneticists. So they weren't really, they probably were kind of political at times, but only where science funding and health and education was concerned. These pseudo-Marxists in university, bollocks again? No, shut up.
In West Africa, we initially continued the barbarism of slavery, but confronted by its cruelty, we ended it, not only for ourselves, but for the world. It wasn't cheap either. Ending the trade cost an estimated 1.8% of our GDP between 1808 and 1867, over twice what we spend on overseas aid today. I'm not ashamed of our history. It may not feel like it, but many of our former colonies, amid the complex realities of empire, owe us a debt of gratitude for the inheritance we left them.
Strip mining, slavery, nicking trillions of pounds, trillions of wealth from their countries. No. Deeply, deeply wrong. Deeply wrong. So shut up, Jenrick. Fucking dickhead.
Oh, it wasn't cheap for us to end slavery. It cost us dearly. I mean, he's making sure he mentions that. What he doesn't mention is that the cost to end it went to the slave owners. Now, Dr. Shola Mo Shogbamimu responded by saying this on Twitter. So Robert Jenrick, the molestation, fetishization, sexual abuse, exploitation, commodification, and systemic rape of black women is the inheritance former colonized nations should thank British Empire for. The caucasity attached are images of the vile treatment Africans were treated by the empire. Now, this is some really astonishing stuff. Samuel, is recognizing the terrible things we did in the empire make us pseudo-Marxists talking gibberish, as Jenrick says?
No, it doesn't. And, I just want to say that picture as well is so triggering, and this story is just so infuriating and just makes me really angry. I guess stories make me kind of angry in general, but I mean, this one in particular, I just think that the direction of the Tory party is a complete joke now. I mean, it has been for a very, very long time, obviously, but it just reeks of a party that has no ideas, no future, and it reeks of desperation because they know that they're not going to be able to do what they need to do in terms of getting more people on side, so they're just throwing bones to their base. It's just disgusting. And as obviously a black person looking at that image and seeing those images of atrocities, I mean, there's many more, unfortunately, images of horrible things that were committed on behalf of the British Empire, but the fact that he said that is so insulting.
Yeah, and I think as well, he's saying it's poisoning the national debate. He's poisoning the national debate because, first of all, he's acting like Keir Starmer is extremely left-wing on this. I'm pretty sure that he came out and said we're not going to do reparations. Obviously, Keir Starmer is trying to appeal to the right. So even Keir Starmer, he thinks, is too left-wing for Jenrick. But what's poisoning the debate is that we've not actually had a real discussion on the empire. There are still effects of the empire that is disproportionately affecting people today. That's why. Why do we have high levels of immigration? Or why do people want to come here? As the poet and writer Akala brilliantly said, well, the Queen and the Crown and the Empire stole the wealth from the global South, brought it to Britain, and people are just following the wealth that was theirs. I think it is absolutely disgusting and it is insulting. But what do you think Jenrick is doing here? I mean, is this a political calculation, given he's running for leader? I don't doubt he personally believes this, but given this
Right, what do we think Jenrick is doing here? He's being a racist piece of shit. What the hell? Huh? Huh. The hell happened there? Come on. Hmm. Okay, that's weird. Can everyone hear me? Huh. I'm trying to get my video to start back up again. I'll actually see me talking. That's weird. If everyone can hear me, that's fine. You can just basically just look at me and hear me instead. That's weird. Oh, yeah, I'm noticing that. Right, source, video capture, add source, add source. Huh, huh, huh.
And many other insane things he said. Is that what we should expect from a generic Tory leadership, or is this just a strategy to win over the membership?
I think it is a strategy you can expect going forward more broadly nationally, because if you look at where we are, you can already see the influence of the Conservatives in America, in the UK, bringing that kind of MAGA style craziness into the UK. And I think in many respects it's already here, right? This is what we see in the rise of reform, which is one of the reasons why the Conservatives are so desperately trying to drag the party in that direction, because they know they can't compete with reform in that sense. So they're trying to make these statements, trigger the libs, if you will. I mean, it's just that's all they have at this point. So they're going to engage in that. I mean, when was the last time you heard, for example, a housing strategy from the Tories that was comprehensive and spoke about lifting people out of poverty? When was the last time you heard about a comprehensive homelessness strategy in terms of ending homelessness? It's just not there. So to your question, what they're just going to continue to do is double down on this MAGA style craziness. I'm not sure. I think it was a reform rally. It wasn't a conservative rally. It was a reform rally a couple of months ago. I'm not sure if you saw it, and they had a sort of MAGA style stage. It was like a conference. They had all these big lights and stuff. And even though it was reform, I can see that influence also starting to drip into the Conservatives and even into the way that mainstream politics is done in the UK, the Americanization of it. But that's another thing as well. But yeah, I think that Robert Jenrick is an odious individual, terrible person, and same with Kemi, who I'm sure our audience doesn't really isn't her biggest fan. I would say that.
I think it is a good point you made. The Americanization of British politics, specifically MAGA. I mean, of course, we are not as extreme as the US right now. You can see elements of it spilling over. In fact, actually, last week we covered the Tommy Robinson rally, or beginning of the week, and we have people with MAGA hats. This is Britain, not America. Why are you talking about a foreign president or, former president, maybe president again? And I think we're using a lot of the culture wars and the arguments from America. Woke started in the US, now it's over here. We're hearing arguments of reverse racism. Actually, we're racist against white people these days. And it is really dangerous because it's not just in reform, but it is seeping into the Conservative Party.
That's a classic of not sorry to interrupt you, but that's a classic of I think his name is it Lawrence? You'll know his surname, Lawrence
Fox.
That's the one.
Yeah.
That's when you when you mentioned the reverse racism, I was like, that is a Lawrence Fox classic right there. That's what I call a Lawrence Fox classic. These group of people cannot, for their own ideological and egotistical reasons, ever admit any wrongdoing on behalf of the British Empire or the idea of white nationalism and white racism. They cannot admit it. It's not going to happen. So, like you said, what you're seeing from these groups of people is this insistence that we are the victims. And, I have to say, this whole fascist strategy, because it is fascist, that MAGA is using at the moment, that Nigel Farage, that Putin, all these guys use, that I'm the victim, it's pretty effective. For all our disagreements with these people, we can see that they really do double down on this idea that they are the ones that are aggrieved. Even though they're the billionaires, even though they're the ones with the old money, they double down on the idea that they are the ones being attacked. And it works for them in many respects because they draw upon people's frustrations who also attach their upsets, their feelings of upset with that. So that's what I think a lot of what we're seeing today as well in politics.
Right. That's us. Video capture. That's us. That's us. Good. Victory. Thank you for your help, Rohak. Very kind. Just minimize me, put me there. Okay. Oh, wrong one. Screen capture. That's yours. Haha. To Tom.
Winston Churchill from office and elect one of its most progressive governments ever.
Housing became the responsibility of this guy, Aneurin Bevan. Bevan believed that council housing could do more than simply provide shelter for the very poorest. Instead, he thought it could serve a means of breaking down social barriers between rich and poor. From the very start, there'd been a big debate over whether council housing should only be available to Let me show you a picture.
This is a photo taken in South London in 1914. At the time, Britain was in the midst of an acute housing crisis. Wealth inequality was soaring, and owning one's own home was beyond the aspirations of all but the very richest. As a result, government figures estimate that around 89% of Brits were forced to live in privately rented accommodation.
The quality of much of that housing was, moreover, abhorrent.
Britain's cities had expanded rapidly during the Industrial Revolution as working class people had flocked to newly bustling factory towns in pursuit of jobs. And amid this rush, little care or attention had been given to ensuring the homes those workers moved to were safe or sanitary.
Landlords sought to cram as many people into the available space as they could.
Between 1851 and 1911, the average footprint of a newly built British home dropped from 913 square metres to just 268. Worse still, rents continued to rise. An influential survey carried out by Maud Pember Reeves in 1913 estimated that working class families were spending around a third of their income on housing, often for little more than a single room.
Sound a bit familiar? It might seem insensitive to compare the housing crisis of the early 20th century to that of today. But a few TVs, internet connections and washing machines aside, it's hard not to see endless similarities.
The third of income spent on housing which Pember Reeves was outraged by in 1913 is now the average for all private renters in the UK. In London, it's more than 50%. As people turn to house shares and studio flats to try and cut costs, the amount of space that we're living in is also dwindling. And with average house prices now sitting between 8 and 9 times the median wage, homeownership is once again becoming a pipe dream for many.
Now for the good news. Over the course of the 20th century, Britain managed to solve its previous housing crisis. Housing poverty wasn't eradicated entirely, but for most people, safe and affordable housing did become a reality. In today's video, I want to explore how we got there, what policies made it possible, and what it might teach us about how we and other countries can solve our housing crises once again.
Rents are going through the roof. People are now paying much more in rent, by and large, than they would be if they were actually able to get a house and pay a mortgage.
Building more homes to buy and for rent are so important.
Earlier this century, leaders faced the challenge of creating a welfare state that could provide security for the new working class.
They voted to stop the existing right to buy council houses, a policy which would kill the hopes and dreams of so many families.
That we shall introduce a measure to control less essential building so that the housing programme, both local authority and private, can go roaring ahead.
I can go anywhere on earth, wherever I've been, I still like my own home the best.
The decision to fix Britain's housing crisis the first time around didn't come from nowhere. Two events conspired to convince those in power that ordinary Brits weren't going to accept living in squalor any longer.
The first was a brutal world war. Between 1914 and 1918, working class men from across the UK were sent off to Europe to fight the most costly war in British history. When those who had survived returned, then Prime Minister David Lloyd George partly felt the country owed them for their sacrifice. Given Russia had just succumbed to revolution, he also had a genuine fear of what might happen in Britain if living standards didn't improve pretty soon.
The second was a massive rent strike.
In 1915, landlords in Glasgow had attempted to take advantage of a wartime housing shortage by announcing immediate rent hikes of up to 25%. Outraged tenants responded by refusing to pay any rent at all.
Look at it. First rent strike right here in my city. Bring it. That is a rather nice poster. I like that.
Under the leadership of campaigner Mary Barber, around 20,000 households eventually joined the Glasgow rent strike, forcing the government to introduce rent controls to placate them. It was clear that this wasn't enough, however.
The keynote legislation that really kind of sets the scene for a sea change in housing provision and the growth of council housing occurs in 1919, when of course Lloyd George had promised Homes for Heroes. And he promised to build 500,000 houses. The 1919 Housing Act was certainly motivated by a desire to reward service and sacrifice.
Whoops.
During the First World
Do
War.
not deny me, Tom.
At the time, it was very explicitly aimed also to offset the fear of revolution.
In 1919, Lloyd George's government introduced this piece of legislation, the Housing and Town Planning Act 1919.
It instructed all city and county councils across the UK to survey the number of homes that they needed to build to meet demand and to make plans to fill that gap.
Crucially, the government would no longer rely solely on private builders to do so. Instead, local councils would be lent money to build houses to rent out themselves. This was effectively the birth of what came to be known as council housing.
These houses were to remain in the ownership of the local government and to be let out for affordable rents. Furthermore, tenancies were to be as secure as possible. While there were strict standards that tenants had to uphold in terms of cleanliness and neighbourly behaviour, as long as they paid their rent, people could basically stay in their homes as long as they wanted.
Alongside improving the affordability of housing, however, the government was also keen to raise standards. Remember, many people at this point were living in slums, which were dank, depressing, and served as petri dishes for disease.
The slums here in Glasgow were particularly problematic. They were horrible, disgusting, vermin-filled places that needed destroyed. It's a good thing that they actually got brought down just before between the two wars and after it. Well, quite a lot of them actually got bombed because they kept on trying to hit the docks here because, oddly enough, Glasgow was building a fuck ton of ships. So great areas like Clyde Bank in the south side, they got ruined essentially. Lots of houses just got destroyed, things like that. So they needed to build new council housing, essentially needed to build new houses. So what happened here in Glasgow just between the wars and just after the Second World War was amazing. Just thousands of houses getting built. Brilliant. Need to go back to that.
Booklet. The Manual on the Preparation of State-Aided Housing laid out the minimum standards which these new council houses should meet.
Houses should, wherever possible, be self-contained, have 2 stories, and include a kitchen, a larder, a fuel store, a living room, an indoor toilet, a private bathroom, and at least 2, if not 3, bedrooms. The manual even gives suggestions for how houses should be laid out on estates to strike.
Funny fact of some of the houses that were already here in Glasgow in different areas, outdoor toilet. Ugh. And for a long time, a lot of places like hotels and things, they still had outdoor toilets. Ugh. I've only used one once. Ugh. Thank God most of them are gone now.
A balance between making good use of the available space and ensuring that everyone has access to light, greenery and transport.
Early council housing may appear quite basic in contemporary standards. Of course, it was light years ahead and better than contemporary private rental and slum housing. And that meant simply, it was sanitary, it was soundly constructed, and so on. Council housing was always better than any kind of private sector equivalent for the working class, through into the 1930s at least.
In fact, this focus on quality initially had a significant impact on affordability.
Rent on the Hillfield estate in Bristol, which was one of the first council estates built following the war, was 9 shillings and sixpence a week, around £17.93 in today's money. That might sound unthinkably cheap by today's standards, and was lower than what a similar property would have cost if rented from a private landlord. But it was still a significant jump up from rents paid in the slums. The result was that these first council houses largely went to the skilled working class, those in stable employment rather than the very poorest. Over the following decades, standards were thus gradually amended to allow for cheaper units which would be more affordable to those looking to escape the slums. The cottage-style homes favoured by the 1919 manual were joined by a number of smaller houses and mid-rise blocks of flats like these in London. Efforts were refocused on actively demolishing slums and relocating people into higher quality council-owned homes.
There is, of course, always a tension, always a conflict in council housing, which is the requirement to build, obviously, both ideally, which was the gold standard, these cottage homes, but in inner city, urban areas, the necessity to build tenement housing. And that's a kind of conflict which plays out right through the history of council housing into its latter days, I suppose.
Whatever form they took, the scale of the project and the speed of the turnaround are hard to overstate. Between 1919 and 1938, local governments built more than 1 million new homes. Of course, in 1938, a new challenge appeared in the form of the Second World War. Working class men were once again sent off to Europe to fight, whilst women were recruited to staff munitions factories and provide medical aid.
Advances in aerial bombing as a military tactic also saw many British cities decimated by the Luftwaffe. At the same time as the war brought new house building to a standstill, a further 2 million homes were destroyed in bombing raids. Rather than letting this setback stop them, however, Brits channeled the sense of national solidarity which had emerged during the war in order to try and eliminate the scourge of unfit housing once and for all. Once Hitler had been defeated, UK voters opted to unceremoniously remove their own wartime leader, Winston Churchill, from office and elect one of its most progressive governments ever.
Housing became the responsibility of this guy, Aneurin Bevan. Bevan believed that council housing could do more than simply provide shelter for the very poorest. Instead, he thought it could serve a means of breaking down social barriers between rich and poor. From the very start, there'd been a big debate over whether council housing should only be available to those who couldn't afford to buy or rent privately, or whether it might provide a more general provision to anyone who needed it.
Not until you get to the first majority Labour government, 1945-51 and the 1949 Housing Act after the Second World War, where you have a clause which specifically removes that qualification, which specifically states that council housing is available to all sections of the community. And this was, Labour as a left-wing party, of course, as quite a radical social democratic party in that post-war period, had a vision of housing serving general needs. This was the technical phrase, general needs, i.e. a cross-section of the community.
Bevan was adamant that there were huge benefits to the latter approach. He told Parliament in 1949 that it was entirely undesirable that on modern housing estates only one type of citizen should live. If we are to enable citizens to live a full life, if they are each to be aware of the problems of their neighbours, then they should be drawn from the different sections of the community. To this end, and despite a continued shortage of materials from the war, the Labour government built a further 1 million houses in just 7 years, more than in the 2 decades of council housing between the wars.
Perhaps more notably, in the years following the Second World War, the belief that the government should play a role in the building and provision of housing came to be a firmly bipartisan affair. Previously, Conservative politicians had generally been quite sceptical of the idea, but by now it would have been electoral suicide to oppose it.
When the Conservative Party returned to power in 1951, they did so partly by promising to build even more council homes than the Labour Party had done. And this wasn't just electioneering, they came good on that promise.
Under Harold Macmillan's tenure as housing minister in the early 1950s, the Conservatives twice built more than 200,000 homes in a...
What the hell have I done there? Oh my god, I've went into streamception mode. Bloody hell. If everyone's okay and aren't too distracted, I think I'll try and figure this out after I finish my stream.
a single year. It's very windy up here. Between 1945 and 1979, local councils in the UK built more than 4.4 million new homes, leaving a total stock of 6.5 million. These homes took on various styles. From 1951 onwards, standalone houses and mid-rise flats were joined by a series of what then seemed like towering new high-rise buildings.
Architects working on these council flats often saw it as an opportunity to experiment with form and function. Various styles of modernism began to fill the landscape, and many cities gained buildings whose silhouettes would become key local landmarks.
In 1956, actually, the Conservative government of the day passes legislation which provides a special subsidy, an increased subsidy to local authorities building over 6 stories in height. So there are lots of incentives, and so late 50s into the mid 60s is the classic era of tower blocks, slab blocks, but high multi-story housing. And of course, it's very visual.
There were some failures along the way. An experiment with prefabricated, system-built housing in the 1960s culminated in the Ronan Point disaster, in which a gas explosion caused a block of flats in Newham in East London to partially collapse. 4 people died and several others were injured.
I always make the corrective or apply.
This is one of the reasons you don't get gas in high rises now, 7 or under. So I'm in a tenement, and it's got 3. There's 6 houses in the close that I live in. So this is probably the highest. It can go up to 6, and that's it. Then the pressures that are needed to get the gas to the top floors is an incredible risk, and that's what happens. So no, they capped it at 7, so that wouldn't happen again. I think they're mostly ones up to 6 floors. So that's either 12 or 18 separate houses, essentially dwellings. So, because there's 6 deckers, each with 3 flats, and a lot of the West End and Partick, Dumbarton Road, streets coming off Dumbarton Road and Byres Road. So that'd be a 6-decker, and they're the only ones that have gas in them, I think. Any of the taller ones, like there's ones about 5 minutes walk away from me. They're 14 or 16 floors high. They don't get gas, they're only electric. So, better not risk it, so they don't do it anymore.
A sort of proviso to that, which is if you look at council housing in the round, you look at it as a whole, over 2/3 of British council housing are 2-storey houses.
On the whole, however, council housing continued to provide quality and affordable housing for those who lived in it. By 1979, somewhere between 30% and 42% of Brits lived in council homes.
Private landlords had been very nearly eliminated entirely, where in 1919, nearly 90% of people had lived in privately rented housing. That number had shrunk to just over 10%. Rent was more affordable than it had ever been too. From a high of a third, working class Brits now spent just over 10% of their income on rent. In a scenario which seems hard to imagine from a modern perspective, or likely from some foreign perspectives, renting one's house from the local government was a normal and mainstream option. Strong tenancy protections meant that where rented housing today can often feel inherently temporary, people were able to build homes, lives and community.
Certainly into the 1950s and into the 60s, I would always make the point that council housing was absolutely, it was aspirational housing. It was a step up for the many millions of working class people that moved into their council homes. So it was absolutely housing of choice for its residents, its new tenants.
It's worth pausing here for a moment to acknowledge quite how much of a turnaround this was from the scenario we were discussing at the very beginning of this video. People still had disagreements with their council landlords, there were still tensions and shortcomings, but in just a few short decades...
Oh my god, it's like they all got designed by the same stupid arse people. See those three you can see in the background of Tom's video there? That's exactly the style that's 5 minutes walk away from me. Same cubes, same tarred roof, everything. My god, that's freaky.
Britain had gone from a nation of slums to one which not only had millions more homes, but was engaged in an ongoing and vibrant experiment into how to house the most people in the best possible way. Nevertheless, the decline in private renting during the middle of the 20th century wasn't solely the result of more people renting off their local council instead.
The huge number of homes that had been built meant that for much of the post-war period, the cost of the average British home hovered around 4 times the average salary. This relative affordability, combined with an increased availability of mortgages, opened home ownership up to the middle class and better off working class people, in a way that would have been unthinkable 50 years previously. By 1970, just over 50% of Brits had managed to buy their own homes. People not only wanted to own their own homes for practical reasons, but home ownership also began to be viewed as a marker of social status, which, in a country as obsessed with class as Britain,
God damn it,
is no small matter.
By the 60s, I think you do have the rise of working class owner occupation. So at that point, in a sense, rental becomes seen as a slightly inferior option. Owner occupation becomes a bit of a gold standard, and it's, of course, it's certainly proclaimed as such by the Conservative government, by politicians on the right primarily. But that's it's a sentiment which is quite widely shared.
This was actually a pretty good example of how public and private systems can work together to enable both stability and choice. For anyone who wanted to and could buy, the option was very much there. And the quality of available houses had no doubt been pushed upwards by the fact that homes needed to be at least as good as council houses in order for people to find them desirable enough to buy. The widespread availability of those council homes, however, also meant that if you were a renter, that didn't mean being completely thrown to the wolves either.
The result was that Nye Bevan's dream of council housing encouraging social mixing across classes never really came to fruition. Instead, a process began to emerge of what came to be known as residualisation. This involved council housing becoming the domain of poorer citizens, while upwardly mobile residents sought to buy their way out.
The sense of social stigma which emerged from all of this was compounded by a right-wing media discourse which began to focus on so-called problem estates, supposedly rife with poverty and crime. As with all such discourses, this was true in some cases, but was far from a universal experience.
The attempt to frame council estates as being, in themselves, corrupting forces helped to distract from the role that broader trends of economic downturn in the 1970s were having on people's lives.
Yeah, nothing at all to do with funding or anything. Nothing to do with marginalisation within your own community. Nope, nothing like that. Doesn't happen. Can't see it.
Nevertheless, these forces combined with a general complacency of belief that housing had kind of been solved to deflate the enthusiasm which had driven the whole project.
None of these problems would have been insurmountable for a government which still believed that the state could play a positive role in driving up standards and pushing down rents in the housing sector. The idea that the government could do much of anything useful, however, was about to come under attack.
And then into the 1970s, really you're looking, and this is putting it somewhat crudely, but I think plausibly, you're looking at what the collapse of what has been termed post-war consensus. As you say, Labour and Conservative parties broadly shared similar politics on housing and some other things, the mixed economy, the health service, foreign policy, and so on. But into the 70s, there's that consensus collapse. It's undermined partly by a shift to the right among the Conservative Party, but it's actually also weakened by growing disillusion with the power and efficacy of the state.
In 1979, this woman, Margaret Thatcher, was elected as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. This is a copy of the manifesto on which she stood.
Among its key pledges is a commitment to building a property-owning democracy. Unlike Labour, it reads, "We want more people to have the security and satisfaction of owning their own property." As we've seen, home ownership had clearly become a widespread aspiration for many people by this point. But Thatcher's ambitions went far beyond this. A true believer in the power of free markets, she wanted to actively reduce the strength of the council housing stock. As she saw it, government-owned housing had the effect of promoting an over-reliance on the state among tenants. And, she supposed, also encouraged people to vote Labour by extension.
In around about the 80s, etc., what you start to see is a move away from that vision, that consensus of home being an essential need, towards government essentially saying that they wanted to slim down government, they wanted to privatise a lot of the stock and sell it off.
A year after her first election, Margaret Thatcher thus passed this bill, the Housing Act 1980. This gave council tenants who had lived in their home for at least 3 years not just the ability, but the legal right to buy their house from the local government.
More than this, it gave them a discount of at least 33% off the market value of their home. And she even made provisions for 100% mortgages, meaning buyers wouldn't even need a deposit. This policy was obviously incredibly popular among those who could access it. I mean, for anyone who could, it would have been ridiculous to turn it down. Here's the opportunity to buy a house for a knockdown price and zero money down. In just the first 3 years of the scheme, 300,000 properties were sold to tenants. In the entire life of the scheme so far, that figure has reached 2 million.
In the short term, this helped to significantly increase the percentage of Brits who owned their own homes. The longer term consequences for the country as a whole, however, were far more destabilising.
You just basically saw lots and lots of people taking advantage of big discounts to try and buy their own home and get on that housing ladder. It was a shift essentially away from people having a decent home as a need and a right, towards people being able to use homes as an asset, as something to get wealth.
See, by the 1980s, the number of council houses being built was already starting to dwindle. But Thatcher made this trend terminal by effectively banning local councils from building new homes to replace those that they sold off. Much of the money raised went straight to central government to fund Thatcher's tax cuts to the rich and pay down the national debt.
Put simply, the financial mechanisms have been designed in such a way that if you sell...
I despise her. Despise her for doing this. Right, fair enough, let people buy their council houses. What the killer blow was, though, is she wouldn't let the councils reinvest that and build more council houses to replace them. Banned them from doing it.
For social rented home, it's not really affordable for councils to be able to take that money that they've got back to build one for one. And we've never reached a point in the entire history of Right to Buy where those homes have been replaced one for one, and we're actually losing far more than we're building.
This was an era of massive privatisations in Britain. Over the next couple of decades, the UK's energy sector, its water sector, its telephone network and railway networks were all sold off to private investors. The great sell-off of council housing, however, was by far the largest of these privatisations, with millions of homes which had previously been owned and managed by local governments placed into private hands. The introduction of the right to buy was as massive a turning point in the history of British housing as the initial introduction of council homes had been in the late 1910s.
The scheme helped keep the Conservative Party in power for 18 years and genuinely changed the lives of many. It was seen as opening a new door to social mobility, which would have taken a cold-hearted politician to close. In fact, when, in 1997, the Conservatives were finally ousted from power by this guy, Tony Blair, he opted to maintain the policy in its entirety. More than just allowing further homes to be sold off, however, Blair's government gave up almost entirely on replacing those homes with new ones. Over the course of 13 years of government, the Labour Party built just 7,870 council properties across the entire country.
When a council wants to build, if you think about it from a council's perspective, they need to borrow money to build, they need to get money from central government in order to be able to build going forward. If they fear, as we're already seeing on some of the newer social housing developments, that those homes are going to be sold off at a big discount, there's no point in financially investing in building as a council, because you may actually lose that unit from it being sold, and you don't get the long-term benefit, which is what your entire initial investment's based on.
As with many of Thatcher and Blair's reforms, the hope had been that the guiding role which had previously been played by the government in housing would now be taken up by the private sector.
For those looking to buy or rent privately, for-profit builders and landlords would step in, with a belief that competition, rather than active state regulation, could keep prices low. For those unable to afford market rents, a group of not-for-profit organisations called housing associations would take up the role of providing subsidised housing at more affordable rents.
As anyone living in the UK will know, however, neither of those hopes came good.
For one, private sector building has never expanded to soak up excess demand. Since the government's all but total retreat from house building during the 1980s and 90s, private building has actually trended downwards. With no government-led house building to compete with, large house building companies have stood accused of being intentionally slow to build on plots of land they have ready to go in the hopes of keeping house prices as high as possible.
If I am a local builder, I am never going to build more than the local market can absorb, in inverted commas. What that effectively means, if you put it in really simple terms, is I'm never going to build enough to drop prices, because that's just against my fundamental business model. And therefore what they do is slow down building in a local area and will actually just drip feed that market in terms of the homes, rather than building out.
It's like they're trying to keep it scarce so they can keep scalping us. Wow.
At speed and selling at a potential lower level than they could do.
If that is their goal, then they've been incredibly successful. As you can see from this graph, during the 1960s and 1970s, house prices generally sat at a little over 4 times the average income. But they've now risen to the point that buying a house is likely to set one back between 8 and 9 times the average salary. It's worth remembering that the explicit goal of the Right to Buy scheme was to increase the percentage of Brits who owned their own home. And the initial sell-off did briefly manage to do so. By 2003, a full 71% of people in the UK had managed to get on the property ladder. But as prices have risen and risen, that number has begun to slump once more.
I thought it
By
was quite bad, I'm
2024,
not.
it plunged back to just 65%.
The private market just simply isn't going to deliver the levels to drive down the cost of housing. And it never has. The last time we hit 300,000 homes a year, which is the amount that the government says it needs to build, was in 1969, and nearly half of them were council-built social homes. As soon as we've cut down those council-built homes, you've just seen house prices skyrocket and the delivery of homes actually kind of nowhere near reaching those levels, they say.
Which might not have been such a problem if there was still the safety net of affordable social housing to fall back on. But the right to buy sell-off, transformative though it may have been for some individuals, has meant that that's no longer the case. During Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair's tenures, many of the council homes which weren't sold were transferred over to housing associations, with the belief that these third sector organisations would be better landlords to those on lower incomes than councils. Yet, the challenges to this have been twofold. Firstly, housing associations have never really had the means to build meaningful numbers of new properties. What's now often referred to as social housing has thus gone from being a widely available provision to something which has to be rationed to those in the most need. As things stand, nearly 1.3 million low-income people are currently stuck on waiting lists for council or housing association homes.
Those numbers are fudged. The qualifiers are incredibly difficult, so they can justify it being lower. Being this level is probably higher because of homelessness and basically sofa surfing, and people waiting on council or social rent housing is probably a lot higher. It's probably sitting somewhere around 3 million, I would guess, maybe 3.5. But the way they've set the levels to say this number, I'll need to go and check actually what how they actually fudge these numbers. But that 1.8, no, that 1.3, totally wrong.
The result is that the overall quality of the homes which remain is generally lower.
Back.
While good social homes do still exist, media stories of deplorable conditions, including black mold, cockroaches, and overcrowding, abound. As financial pressures have caused housing associations to grow and merge into ever larger organisations, tenants have reported cultures of unresponsiveness and victim blaming for clear institutional failures.
What tenants have complained about in many cases is that housing associations, have a bit more like private entities. And of course, if they're being pushed to make efficiencies within their business, then what they'll tend to do is maybe have one, cut down the number of housing officers that are looking after a certain number of units. That means that their attention splits. So when a social tenant has a problem, they might find that their housing association housing officer isn't really able to be quite as nimble or as address those issues, and is often just trying to bat off people rather than actually try to address them.
Here's the thing for you, because I'm social housed, technically when me and Super Happy moved in here, we were council tenants. We are the last council tenants in this block 6. The other 5 tenants in this close, they're all set at higher rent than what me and Super Happy are. So we're the last 2, I think we're one of the last few actual former council tenants. Oh, not again. God damn it, not again. Source. Video. Add source. Add source. Oh, God damn it.
As we saw, during the 1970s, private landlords were effectively on their way to being abolished entirely in the UK.
Official figures show that the number of people renting privately plummeted from 89% in 1914 to just 10% in 1979. In the years since, however, a cottage industry of private landlordism has risen up to overtake social housing and become the second largest provider of housing once again. The most obvious impact of this has been on cost. A recent article in Landlord Today suggested that private tenants are now spending an average of 38% of their take-home pay on rent. In fact, this article on the website of estate agent Savills suggests that the rents that landlords can charge now has little to do with competition and is instead limited only by an affordability ceiling, above which tenants simply cannot afford to pay.
So at the moment, we've got record levels of homelessness. There are about 150,000 homeless children right now. We have rents at their highest levels since records began and rising, faster than they have done in many, many years. We're talking about people now simply not able to find a new home, because the rent's just way too high. And a lot of people are simply saying that even when they're in their tenancy, the landlords are just hugely raising rents.
Just as important, however, have been changes to security of tenure. Social homes have always had relatively strong protections for tenants in terms of how long someone can stay in their home. Effectively, as long as someone pays their rent and doesn't destroy the property, they can usually stay in that property for as long as they want.
What often goes less acknowledged is that, for much of the 20th century, similar stipulations were enforced on private landlords too. The understanding was that for people to be able to rent a property and then make it a home, they needed to have some certainty that they weren't going to be thrown out on a whim. Thatcher had another surprise for us here.
In 1988, she introduced these things: assured short-hold tenancy contracts. These allow landlords to let out properties for a minimum term of just 6 months, after which...
That is daft. Seriously, that is daft. I've got a long-term tenancy. It doesn't end. Just a little bit doomery here for a second. Whatever one of us shuffles off this mortal coil first, the other one still gets to stay in the house, still gets to stay in the flat, which is a good thing. I like that. So I'm quite lucky because I signed with Glasgow City Council, not Glasgow Housing Association. We are currently NG Homes. So I'm one of the lucky few.
They can evict a tenant with just 2 months' notice.
Naturally, pretty much all landlords now use these contracts. They give them a huge amount of power to simply throw a tenant out if they want to sell up, or if the tenant makes too many maintenance requests or doesn't agree to another rent hike.
In 1988, the housing regulation around renting was basically torn apart, and that basically meant that renters had lost their rights. They could be evicted for any reason, which means they can't challenge unfair rent increases because the landlord will just kick them out if they start complaining about it, and then when they do, they simply can't find anywhere else to go.
Amid all this uncertainty, unaffordability and black mould, it's hard not to perceive the UK as having arrived firmly back at this picture.
After multiple decades in which the country had all but solved its housing crisis, we've effectively legislated to actively create one once more.
But what might we learn from the UK's great 20th century experiment with council housing in trying to fix the housing crisis today? At the heart of the UK's current housing crisis is very clearly a lack of supply.
The government has effectively given up building homes, and this has allowed both mortgages and rents to shoot up well beyond what is affordable or just. This lack of government ambition has been further hindered by a planning system which too easily allows nearby NIMBYs to vote down any planned private developments in order to defend the value of their own homes. There are, however, some who will argue that this lack of building is the only problem. that if we strip away some of these planning regulations, the free market will simply step in and build a bounty of new homes for all. Problem solved. The reality is that the quality of the houses we build and the terms on which they're offered to either buyers or tenants matters hugely too.
A lot of people have been talking about just saying, let's unleash the private sector and reform planning to try and they'll just sort it all out and we don't need to worry about this social housing problem. Well, what we've seen is the private developers have never ever delivered the 300,000 homes target that the government are setting.
A few months ago, this essay, called Foundations, went semi-viral on Twitter.
Written by a group of free market advocates, it implied that simply rolling back planning regulations could open Britain up to building as many houses as it did in the final few decades of the 19th century. In doing so, however, it entirely overlooks the fact that while the UK did build a lot of houses during that period, an awful lot of them were slums. In fact, as we've seen, the adventure in council house building in 1919 wasn't because the private sector wasn't building enough houses, but because when left to its own devices, it overwhelmingly built dank, depressing, unsanitary shoeboxes for landlords to cram people into.
Current practices in private house building don't inspire too much confidence either.
Newly built properties in the UK have become notorious for being so poorly and haphazardly built that they often have significant problems to deal with before.
Who'd have thought that? Private house builders building shoddy housing. Makes you wonder.
Before anyone's even lived in them. They're also tiny. The average size of a newly built British home has decreased every decade since the 1970s, with the footprint of the average living room shrinking by 32%. As a result, a recent survey revealed that just 21% of Brits would actively choose a new build house over an older property if they had the choice.
Historically, council housing has provided superior housing at those lower rents. You can't look to the rabbit hutch houses of the mass developers. You can't trust them to build well. The lesson of council housing is in terms of space standards, in terms of energy standards and so on. Council housing at its best has been innovative. It's been of good aesthetic quality. And I think particularly as we face not only a housing crisis, of course, but a climate crisis, as we're going forward, and this is being certainly embraced by housing associations and local authorities, we look to the public sector to really kind of pioneer and be at the very vanguard of building high quality, sustainable housing into future decades.
If the goal was simply to build more houses, then planning reform might suffice. But to really fix the housing crisis, we need to build good, high-quality, affordable homes with secure tenancies.
Throughout the course of the 20th century, council housing, built by and for local governments, not only provided high-quality homes for the tenants that lived in them, but also pushed up quality across the board by forcing private builders to compete with them.
You end up with a situation whereby the most obvious solution is the best, i.e. the government should get back into the business of building. We need to get councils back building. That was the time when people in the post-war years started to have genuinely affordable homes, decent lives, and the stability of a place that they can call home that can help them have the foundation for a future. We know that model of just relying on the private market and just saying planning reform over and over again and no investment doesn't actually work. The proof's in the pudding. This is the situation we're in. It's a massive housing emergency. We need to get building, and we need to get building social rent homes.
If we want to find our way back to a place where having an affordable place to live is a norm and not just a luxury, then building significantly more social homes needs to be part of our plan. We've done it before, and we can do it again. The steep rise in house prices and rents over the past couple of decades has turned housing into a deeply generational issue.
For many in our parents' generation, home ownership was a fairly achievable aspiration. But for those of us who have come after, getting on the so-called housing ladder has become harder and harder. In fact, the rise of the housing crisis is a key theme in my debut feature-length documentary, Boomers, which, depending on when you're watching this video, either comes out tomorrow or, well, is out now.
Eek! Is that something we're going to cut back to? I'm going to go like, it's out tomorrow, and then I go, eek! Boomers takes a provocative look at the generation wars which sometimes seem to have taken over our political and cultural conversations. Making it has involved me travelling across the US and Europe in an effort to try and understand the lives and legacy of the baby boomer generation, investigating the seismic changes they've enacted on the world around us and the economic, social and ecological devastation which seems to have followed in their wake. Boomers is available to watch exclusively on Nebula, the creator-owned streaming service that I've been a part of for a couple of years now. In fact, it's precisely because Nebula commissioned the film and took it on as a Nebula original production that I've been able to work with the incredible team of creatives who have helped me hone the film, add an original score, and make it look absolutely gorgeous. Boomers is by far the most ambitious thing I've ever made, and I cannot wait to share it with you all. If you're not already signed up to Nebula, then now is a fantastic time to jump on board. Alongside Boomers, we've got a whole host of other Nebula original productions which are coming out, which, much like Boomers, are not available to watch anywhere else. Abigail Thorne of Philosophy Tube's short film Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend and Wendover Productions' game show series The Getaway are available to watch right now. And we've recently announced a feature-length documentary by Bobby Broccoli called 17 Pages, which I cannot wait to see. All of this is part of Nebula's big push into curating the best collection of creator-made shows available anywhere. If you'd like to sign up to Nebula and watch Boomers, then you can get a cheeky little discount on doing so by using my personal link go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. That'll give you a 40% discount on an annual plan, meaning you can watch Boomers and all of that other great stuff for just $3 a month. We've also recently launched lifetime memberships, which have proven really popular. They obviously cost a bit more up front, but secure you access to Nebula for as long as both you and the platform exist. In fact, the revenue we raise from those lifetime memberships is going straight back into funding more ambitious projects like Boomers to keep you entertained and informed for long into the future. Signing up to Nebula using my personal link really does help to support the work that we do here. So thank you so much to everyone who has done so already. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. I'll see you over on Nebula and cannot wait to hear what you think of Boomers. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it's given you lots to think about in terms of how we fix the housing crisis. And if you've just watched that Nebula spot, then please do go over to Nebula and stream Boomers when it comes out. I'm really proud of it. Can't wait to share it with you all. All that's left for me to do is to thank my top tier supporters over on Patreon.
Okay, the next one on my watch list is from a rather new and small channel called Edge of the Map. It's a story about Scottish independence, but it goes right back. It's an hour and 45 minutes. It's quite involved. I congratulated them on actually doing it because that must have taken them bloody ages to do. So well done. He's Scottish and Welsh. I don't think I'm not sure where he lives actually. It's a good bloody question. Oh, good actually, yeah. Sort it. Let's see how far we can get into this.
We have chosen unity over division and positive change rather than needless separation.
Scotland could be pulled out of the European Union after the people of Scotland had voted so overwhelmingly in favour of staying.
Scotland's hugely influential former First Minister, was arrested this afternoon.
32% backing the SNP, which would be the first Labour lead in a decade.
Leaving the single market and customs union, ending freedom of movement, denying Scotland her democracy.
After winning nearly all of the seats in Scotland in 2015, they're now into single digits.
Shh, here it comes.
Stop the race against us! She stopped the race against Sato! She stopped the race against us!
She turned the race against you, mate, aye.
She stopped the race against us!
The UK is in a slow-moving crisis. When isn't it? Most Scots, Welsh and Northern Irish my age want to leave the Union behind, with plenty more also in support. It isn't inconceivable that in 20 years' time the United Kingdom will be a relic of the past and we'll all be living in entirely separate countries. And like it or not, if things don't change now, this is the future that we're heading for. Why? What is so bad about the UK that so many people want to leave it? Well, to try and answer that question, throughout this series I'll be talking to politicians, journalists, activists, former leaders and ordinary people as well, to try and explore why we live in a disunited kingdom. It's fucking cold. In this episode, I'm in Scotland, where 10 years ago, the country voted in a referendum on whether or not it should leave the UK. Scotland voted to stay, but 1 decade on, the independence movement hasn't gone away. Despite being a part of the same country for the last 300 years, many Scots still feel that there's a great divide between Scotland and the rest of the UK. To explore why this is, we need to go back. Way back. When looking at a geological map of the British Isles, it's mostly pretty calm, up until that. This is because the land that now forms Scotland came from a different tectonic plate to the land that now forms England and Wales, and around 300 to 400 million years ago, they collided, forming the island of Great Britain. Pay attention to these bits. The top one's Scotland, and the bottom one is England and Wales, and bam! There you go. The border of where the plates collided is roughly the same as where the England and Scotland border is today.
So is it just a massive coinkydink that the line where the mega continents crashed into each other is pretty much exactly where today's England-Scotland border is? Or are the rocks from 400 million years ago still shaping the identities of these countries?
The collision between the plates formed the Scottish Highlands, which are famous throughout the world for their staggering natural beauty. Nowhere is more beautiful than the Isle of Skye. Unfortunately, when I went to visit it, this is what the weather was doing. Most of Scotland's land looks like this. It's the high lands. And unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do with this kind of land apart from admire it. We pick up the story around 400 million years later. A bunch of Italians were decimating England almost as hard as the modern Conservative Party. But they couldn't quite make it up to the end because of a bunch of Celts who'd painted themselves blue. The Romans called these people the Picts and thought the best way to keep them out of their newly formed Britannia was to build a big wall.
We're going to build the wall. We have no choice. We have no choice.
In the 5th century, a group of Irishmen called the Scots migrated over the sea to the area in the Western Isles. After mixing in with / conquering the native Picts, the two groups eventually formed Scotland. Alright, just hold your horses a minute. So technically Scotland was founded properly in like 800 and something, but to be honest, the way we think of Scotland and England and basically any European country during this era, it's very different to what they are today. Most European countries didn't have clean starts in the way that we think of a modern nation state. The English are often taught that their country was founded in 1066, which is weird because that's willfully ignoring hundreds of years of English tea, crumpets and bloodshed. But whatever, not my problem. If you step back in time and ask the average person who lived here in 843 what country they lived in, they won't understand you because you don't speak medieval Gaelic. Can you me a tuition? Ach, the assassin Cordona. Yeah, I fucking know shit. Over the next few hundred years, the Kingdom of Scotland would seek to gain legitimacy by conquering neighbouring lands. The British Isles were under constant threat during this period, from Angles to Saxons to Vikings to dysentery. This period saw many Scottish kings come and go, but none are more famous than Macbetha Mac Finlech, or in English, he is simply known as Macbeth. Aye, that Macbeth. The story of Macbeth is a good example of Scottish politics at the time. It's all about plotting and murder and witches and loopholes about childbirth. In real life, Macbeth rose to power after probably killing his cousin, who himself probably killed Macbeth's father. Macbeth then married his cousin's widow after probably killing her husband. This put him in charge of one region in Scotland, only to be challenged by the king of another, King Duncan. In the play, Duncan is murdered by Macbeth, who up until that point was one of Duncan's most loyal and trusted men.
Fuck you! You just got pranked! Yow!
In reality, however, the two were always rivals, and they met in battle in 1040, and Duncan was killed by Macbeth's forces, thus making Macbeth the unquestioned ruler of Scotland. For a bit. Macbeth ruled for almost 2 decades before he was killed in battle by Malcolm III, who would become king just a few months later after ironing out some kinks like assassinating Macbeth's stepson. Truly a beautiful history of the nation. Scotland still wasn't properly unified yet. Much of the Highlands was still controlled by the clan chiefs, much of the Isles by the Vikings, and the area around the English border was constantly changing hands. Moments of war and bloodshed between the two countries were occasionally interrupted by peace and begrudging respect. The border between the two was agreed upon in 1237 under the Treaty of York, with the modern border mostly being about the same. However, peace between the two countries wouldn't last. In fact, just a few decades later, the English were out for blood. In 1286, Alexander III of Scotland died. His reign was largely successful, as he had expanded Scotland's control over much of the Western Isles as well as the Isle of Man. Unfortunately, however, he kicked the bucket when his heir was still needing her nappy changed. His daughter Margaret was just 4 years old in 1290 when she was sent from Norway to Orkney and died. This left a gap in the Scottish crown, which was filled in with opportunism and infighting. But it wasn't just the Scottish nobles who wanted to make the most of the situation. Introducing the Scots' worst enemy ever, Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward I was a bastard who, after kicking the Jews out of England and stealing all their stuff, conquered Wales and then turned his attention northwards. Following the succession crisis, the Scottish nobles thought they'd let Edward take charge as a sort of caretaker. This might seem bonkers today, but keep in mind at the time, Scotland and England were enjoying a decades-long peace, and the Treaty of York had already established that these were two different countries with defined borders. Anyway, Edward didn't give a fuck about that. There were two main claimants to the Scottish throne, one of whom will be important later, but for now, Edward essentially forced both men to swear allegiance to him. The King of the Scots would essentially be licking Longshanks' boot, like a cuck. Edward demanded high taxes from Scotland, and he conscripted a lot of Scotland's best men to fight in England's wars. Here's a nice gooey fact for you. For centuries, Scotland and France were basically best friends because of their mutual hatred of their one really annoying neighbour. Edward didn't really like this special relationship, so he marched his army into Berwick, a town near the border, and slaughtered everybody. The English army pushed further into Scotland and were met by the Scots in the Battle of Dunbar. The Scots lost, and King What's-His-Face was forced to abdicate and was sent to the Tower of London, where he stayed for a bit and then fucked off to retire in France. Good for him. The rest of Scotland, though, didn't fare so well, with the Scottish citizens being treated, well, about as well as the English have treated everyone throughout their history. Much of Scotland's wealth and historical artefacts were stolen, with some not being returned until 1996. Fucking English people, man. Worse than that though, under occupation, Scotland's people were treated like second-class citizens. And all in all, it was fucking horrible. It seemed as though Scotland's days of independence were over and the lands north of the Tweed were destined to be forever known as the north of England. Truly a fate worse than death. Luckily though, Scotland had hope in the form of one giant ass mad lad.
William Wallace, Scottish rebel, this is war I cry. Many English fought me, and many English died.
Despite being Scotland's national hero, much of William Wallace's life is soaked in myth and mystery. We're not sure exactly when he was born, or where, or even what he looked like. Clan Wallace themselves are shrouded in mystery as to where they originated from, but since this is my video and I'm Scottish and Welsh, I'm going with the theory that they're Welshmen, as in the Old French word Wales, being another word for foreigner, which by the way is what Wales means in Anglo-Saxon. Even our name comes from colonialism. Anyway, Wallace likely came from lower nobility. He wasn't a peasant, but he also wasn't that important either. In 1297, under occupation, an English sheriff upset Wallace in some way. Now some movies will tell you it's because the sheriff murdered Wallace's wife, which... sure, maybe, but for all we know, maybe it's because they got in a heated argument over which Star Wars trilogy is best. It's the prequels, by the way. You can't tell me The Phantom Menace sucks while thinking a movie with teddy bears and a second Death Star is one of the best ever made. Callum. Wallace and the sheriff's disagreement ended violently, with Wallace killing him for whatever reason. You might be wondering how exactly a minor noble was able to do this, to beat a seasoned English sheriff in a fight, and the answer to that is pretty simple. The guy was a giant. Basically every historical account puts him somewhere above 6 foot at least, some stretching even further to 7. Which is probably just the mythology exaggerating things, but his height is also evidenced by the length of his sword. It's massive, and you can still see it today at the Wallace Monument. More on that place later. If he were alive today, William Wallace would be considered pretty tall, but back in a time when the average height was like 5'7", he was probably one of the largest guys around. Picking a fight with him was like picking a fight with Bane from Batman. You were not going to come out of that well. After killing the sheriff, Wallace found himself leading a small band of Scottish rebels who grew in number as he fled English occupation. Later on in the year, Wallace met with Andrew de Murray, who's probably the third most significant Scottish hero behind Wallace and the guy we haven't got to yet. Much like with Wallace, not much is known about Murray except that he came from the same nobility that can trace his past back to Macbeth. Poorly. If you've never heard of this guy, it's because he's mostly been completely overshadowed by Wallace outside of Scotland, so much so that he's not even in Braveheart, which is kind of outrageous, but that's Hollywood for you. It does mean that I don't even have a recognisable celebrity to portray him, so fuck it, we're going Connery. At the time, both of these guys were equally as important, with Wallace mainly leading the rebellion in the west, and
So that was a funny choice to go with fucking Connery.
Murray in the north. Scotland generally had fallen into chaos by this point, and a lot of Scottish nobles were fed up with the occupation, so joined in the fight to kick the English out. Murray started his rebellion basically the moment the English occupation began, and upon hearing about Wallace's one, he marched his armies towards him so that they could come together. Their aims were pretty simple: return the Scottish king to the throne and kick the English out of Scotland. Longshanks didn't really go for that, and so he sent more troops northwards to deal with the rebellions. Which is telling, because it was only the year before when England claimed sovereignty over Scotland, so it's not as if there weren't already a lot of English soldiers already there. The English army met the rebels here at Stirling, which I'd argue is Scotland's most beautiful city. So let's go there. Wallace's sword. They were not kidding about it being long. For much of Scotland's history, Stirling was the strategically most important city to hold. This is because its position in the heart of Scotland meant that anyone wanting to go northwards across the Highlands basically had to go through Stirling first. We won't get super...
Oh, by the way, they didn't know where the bridge was. There is 5 possible candidates, but they have no fucking clue. I always thought that a bit funny. There is heated debate about where it actually is. For one, it doesn't really matter Where the castle is on that hill, you can see for miles for anyone coming from the south, essentially anyone coming up from England. And you can fortify it from behind as well. So you're never crossing that river. Like you can see in this painting, you can't get across it. All the bridges were wooden. There's little stumps left in the bed of the river, and they can't decide where the battle was waged, essentially. And the stairs really are that bad, and the Wallace Monument, be wary if you come up to visit it. It's worth it, as long as you can handle the stairs, which I struggled with. And the sword is fucking massive.
Into the battle, but TLDR, it was mostly fought on a bridge. The battle was Stirling Bridge. It says here, according to this thing, that the Scots were heavily outnumbered, but the English suffered from poor leadership, which is something that hasn't really changed. So you can see how sneaky the river is, and basically what happened was the bridge was here, and the English were crossing over onto one of these parts where they were basically cut off from the rest of the land. And the Scots attacked them on the bridge, cutting off the English soldiers, surrounding them, and killing them all. England went in with 7,000 infantry, with 5,000 being killed. It's unknown how many Scots died, but certainly nowhere near those numbers. One Scot though who wouldn't come out of the battle so well was Andrew de Murray. He suffered a pretty serious wound, and a few months later, he was dead. Now on his own, Wallace again had to face the English army in the Battle of Falkirk, with Longshanks himself leading the battle. It didn't go so well. The Scottish army was badly defeated, and Wallace himself would live the rest of his life in exile, hiding from the English, until he was eventually found and his head was put on a spike.
The prisoner wishes to say a word.
Dear Lord, that's the loudest profanity I've ever heard.
I remember back before the war started when Scotland was having the succession crisis, and it was mostly between these guys, and Longshanks went with King What's-His-Face. Well, the other guy was called Robert the Bruce. Although this isn't actually the Robert the Bruce, I kind of lied a bit. You see, Robert the Bruce had a son called Robert the Bruce who had a son called Robert the Bruce, and it's that Robert the Bruce that is the Robert the Bruce. You with me? Anyway. Bruce's parents got together after his mother locked his father up in their castle, not letting him out until he popped the question. The Bruces were a very powerful family in Scotland, so when the War of Independence broke out, he was a very powerful man. When war broke out, the Bruce family stayed loyal to Longshanks, thinking that when the war was over, they would be rewarded with the Scottish crown. So it was a bit of a shock to them when it became clear that England was just invading Scotland point blank. After realising the English were here to stay, Bruce then threw his support behind the rebellion. He was made one of the Guardians of Scotland, along with another man, John Comyn. And those two had their disagreements. Both were powerful men with claims to the Scottish throne. So, on the 10th of February 1306, when Bruce and Comyn met in a church to discuss Scotland's future, and only one of them came out, it was pretty suspicious. Whether or not Bruce was the one who stabbed Comyn is unknown, but he was certainly responsible for his death.
The Bruce got excommunicated for that because you're not meant to kill people in a chapel. Rather naughty of him, really. And he's right, we still don't know if he actually killed him or if one of his coterie killed him, so we still don't know that. So, first time we managed to get time travel sorted, that's where I'm going back to see if he actually killed Comyn. That'd be quite fun to know.
As Bruce saw it, Scotland could never unify while there was still a succession crisis. Scotland needed a clear leader, and since Bruce really wanted that leader to be him, despite him being the one with the weaker claim, the only solution was to assassinate his rival. That's medieval Scotland for you. The fact that Bruce killed his rival and the most powerful noble in Scotland in a church was a super big deal. The Pope, upon hearing the news, was like, what the fuck? And he excommunicated Bruce, which might not seem like a big deal, but back when the church more or less had the final say over most European affairs, this was kind of huge. It's like the head of the EU putting out an arrest warrant for Keir Starmer. Bloody murder or not though, Scotland now had resolved the succession crisis. Even though he was an international pariah and an enemy of the Pope, the Archbishop of Glasgow pardoned Bruce for his crimes and then coronated him the King of Scots. So this coronation was a bit of a joke. Only half the nobles turned up, and it didn't even have the Scottish crown jewels or the Stone of Destiny. That's the thing that England only gave back in the 90s. Bloody England. Speaking of England, by this point they'd killed almost all of Bruce's entire family. So his reign was not off to a great start. For some time, Bruce only ruled over a couple of isles. Leven, mostly in exile, hiding from the English. And 1307 though, things started to change. After Bruce managed to sway more nobles to the cause, the Scots gradually started to beat the English back. Upon hearing this news, Longshanks once again wanted to meet this new rebellion in person in battle. However, this time there was a snag. He caught dysentery on the journey. Symptoms include fever, severe dehydration, abdominal pain, the feeling he can't stop shitting, and bloody diarrhea. It's a pretty bad way to go, and I'm glad he got it, and I'm glad it's how he died. On the 7th of July, Longshanks' son, Edward II, became king. Edward II was not as successful as his father at anything, to be honest. And also, he was probably gay, which in the 1300s wasn't great.
So, moving on, things are still looking a bit ragged around the Scottish border, so who's up for that then?
Sire, as your foremost northern lord, I feel perhaps I may be best placed to...
Really? I thought this might be one for Lucentia.
There's Lord Chancellor, Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord High Admiral, Lord Privy Seal.
Stop it.
I'm not pulling this out of nowhere, like, this was genuinely basically what it was like. If any single English king was gay, it was this guy. And yeah, he really did give most of the important jobs to his toy boy. While England was adjusting to its new leader, Bruce was moving around Scotland, asserting his claim to the throne. A lot of the nobles still supported John Comyn. Not that John Comyn, but his cousin, who was also called John Comyn. Bruce was severely ill throughout all of this, but his forces prevailed, and in 1309, the north was his. The same year, he held his first Scottish Parliament in St Andrews, where he was basically absolved of the murder and was confirmed king again, but with most of the bishops and nobles actually supporting him this time around. The decisive battle for the lowlands was once again centred around Stirling, this time a 10-minute drive away from the castle in a place called Bannockburn, which would see the main action.
Oops. Want to stop doing that?
Somewhere. You can see Stirling Castle just through the trees there. And in 1314 it was occupied by the English. But Robert de Bruce's army had already been taking a lot of Scottish land back to the Scots.
Bannockburn is about 6 miles away from the castle, or the centre of Stirling, essentially. Ah, lovely monument.
So they basically said, well, if the rest of the English army doesn't get here within a certain amount of time, they'll just hand the castle over to Bruce. So the King of England sends his boys out, marching all the way from London, whereas Bruce and his lot had been camping here for weeks studying the terrain.
Do you see the beast? Have you got it in your sights?
Clear enough, Mitch Moneypenny. This should present no significant problems.
So when the exhausted English did arrive, although it was in much greater numbers than the Scottish army, they were completely outmatched. 700 years ago, the grassland behind me was fertilised with the blood of English soy boys. Although the English's force was several times larger than the Scots, they came out of it being entirely wiped out, with Edward II himself fleeing the battle. And the years after Bannockburn, the Scots managed to drive the English out of the country, and they even started invading English territory. Bannockburn today is seen as the most decisive battle in Scottish history, and you can visit the site today, where they have this massive monument of guess who. Hostilities between Scotland and England remained, but with the Scots' sovereignty reclaimed, they began to seek a diplomatic end to the War of Independence. With the Scottish military position looking a lot stronger, Bruce started communicating with the Pope, basically asking if they can be best friends again. The most famous document from around this time is called the Declaration of Arbroath. It basically made the case that Scotland was a distinctive country and England was going way over the line by invading it. And also, because of that, Bruce was entirely justified in everything he did in the name of Scottish independence. It also said that an independent Scotland was the right of the Scottish people, and that the people of Scotland should never be subject to English rule. While this wasn't necessarily like a legal document, it was Scotland's case to the international community, if you can call it that Scotland was its own independent country. England, meanwhile, was in a bit of a state as Edward II had been deposed by the she-wolf of France, who was his wife. They fought each other in a civil war, so if you think your parents' divorce was messy, to be fair to her, she probably just got tired of...
Smells good, I will say that. Right there. God, he smells good.
Eventually, the English crown found itself on the head of Edward III. He was just a boy at the time. In 1328, England signed a peace deal which recognised Bruce's right to rule over an independent Scotland. After 30 long years, the war was over and Scotland had won. Bruce would die just a year later from disease. We're not sure which one, but probably not dysentery though. Although Bruce was dead, he died knowing that his country was safe and his lineage was guaranteed. For about 4 years. Okay, we're just gonna fire through this because much like the Scots at the time probably said, this is getting pretty tiring. Remember King what's his name from the succession crisis? Well, now his son's back and he wants the Scottish throne for himself, and he's willing to work with the English to get it.
For those of you who are unaware of the drama I recently brought upon myself, I'll fill you in.
This guy was also called Edward because apparently all of the villains in the story are. The two Edwards invaded Scotland, were met with fierce resistance everywhere they went, which they subsequently crushed. Bruce's son David fled to France, and Scotland fell to English influence. Again.
It's shite being Scottish!
After King What's-His-Face pledged loyalty and gave a bunch of land to King Edward III, a lot of his supporters thought he was going too far and started to have second thoughts. These doubts turned to rebellion after France started throwing money at them. In 1336, a truce was agreed between the Scots and the English, but not between King What's-His-Face and the other Scottish factions. Without England to back him up, Edward What's-His-Face started losing. Badly. In 1336, France officially joined the fight and started attacking England's coastline, and this conflict eventually led into
Any guesses for where this is the start of?
a little thing called the 100 Years' War, which kept England busy for quite some time. With Edward What's-His-Face defeated and Edward III busy dealing with France, Scotland again won the war. All England got out of it was a war that lasted over a century that they would eventually lose. Great job, fellas. In the end, all the Second War really achieved was fucking up these three countries. David returned to the throne, and the Second War was largely forgotten about. Though this wasn't the last time England and Scotland fought each other, not by a long shot, it was the last time, almost, that England tried to completely take over Scotland. And now, coming to you on Edge of the Map, it's the National Anthem of Scotland. So you might be wondering, if Scotland wasn't conquered by England, then why is the UK a thing? After David eventually died in natural causes, he was replaced by his son, Robert II, the first in the House of Stuart. He was eventually replaced by his son James, who was assassinated, who was replaced by his son James, who died in an exploding cannon accident. Then came James III, James IV, James V, Mary, not Bloody Mary, she was English, and then James VI. Meanwhile, England's monarchy had shifted a lot. There were these things called the Wars of the Roses, which resulted in a guy from Wales taking over the English monarchy. His son was Henry VIII, you've probably heard of him, he's the one with all the wives. And one of his daughters was Elizabeth I. She imprisoned her cousin Mary Queen of Scots for most of her reign, but anyway. She died without an heir, leaving England without a monarch. And since the English wanted to avoid instability, they basically asked Scotland if they could borrow James. Quite the twist since the days of Longshanks. This wasn't totally out of the blue. Back in the day, Henry VII, that's the Welsh one, his daughter / Henry VIII's sister married James IV. So James VI wasn't too far down the Tudor family tree anyway. And so in 1603, James VI of Scotland also became James I of England. And then Guy Fawkes tried to blow him up, but that's a story for another time.
Remember the dual numbers. The 6 comes first because he was our king. Here we go. This is the bit of Scottish history that infuriates me the most.
James was not the King of Britain. These were still two separate countries with different parliaments. And speaking of parliaments, James's son Charles I got on so badly with the English parliament that it eventually led to the English Civil War, and eventually to his execution. This was part of the wider and cool-sounding War of the Three Kingdoms. The Three Kingdoms being Scotland, England and Ireland. Wales wasn't a kingdom anymore, sorry Wales. To save some time, Charles was very controversial anyway, but after England killed the King of Scotland and Ireland as well, shit really hit the fan. Cromwell led the English to fight against the other two, and actually succeeded in being the first person ever to unify the entire British Isles. And almost no one talks about it. This period isn't really mentioned outside of these isles. The English swapped out their king for a king in orbit name. Big deal. And when it does get mentioned, it's always from an English or Irish perspective. Why Irish? I can't wait to do Ireland's episode, it's gonna be so fun. The War of the Three Kingdoms is probably its own video, and me framing Cromwell's conquest as England versus Scotland is just kinda silly. This wasn't like the Wars of Independence, there was a lot more going on than just one nation versus another. So let's just cut to the aftermath. The Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland, the first time the British Isles were united as one country. At first they had a flag like this, which is pretty boring, but then, hey, that looks familiar. This isn't the origin of the flag, by the way, that was made by James dual numbers. It's just the first time that it was used to represent the country because it was the first time that Britain was a country. Sorry, I had to mention that or people would get mad. Do you realise how fucking long these are? You know it's just me doing this and I've only got like 5,000 subscribers. Oh yeah, subscribe. Once the English conquered Scotland and the Scottish Parliament was dissolved, it was mainly the English who were put in charge of running it. They weren't trying to foster a British identity, they were trying to make Scotland and Ireland more like England, which in this context meant destroying any links to the royal family or deviant versions of Christianity, which by the way is why Cromwell went so hard on Ireland. After Cromwell's son completely fucked it, the monarchy was restored, along with the Scottish Parliament. Scotland's other institutions were also restored, and Charles II was once again the King of Scotland and England separately. Charles II was succeeded by James VII, who was Catholic, and one of the reasons why Charles I, the one who got his head cut off, was so controversial was because he was Catholic. It was thought after the Restoration the royals would move away from Catholicism, but it was becoming clear that wasn't going to happen. Luckily, James had a nice Protestant daughter who was married to a Dutch prince, and so in 1689 the English Parliament basically invited the couple to depose James. Dutch people think of this as a proper invasion, but seeing as the English Parliament...
Yes, it's called the Glorious Revolution down there. It's not up here. It's called the Bloody Revolution because they tried to kill us again.
Literally called it the Glorious Revolution.
That is a straight face. I'm pulling right now. Straight.
Although the new monarchs were welcomed into England, in much of Scotland and Ireland, as per usual, it was a different story. Completely unrelated, any of you guys watched Game of Thrones back when it was good? Remember the Red Wedding when Robb Stark's army and family were invited under pretense of peace and then suddenly got violently slaughtered? Did you know that's based on something that really happened? And guess what country it happened in? There are two reasons why people visit Glencoe today. Either you want to take in the natural beauty and maybe ride on the Harry Potter train, or you want to take in the dark past that lies between these mountains. One aspect of Scotland's history we haven't really touched on yet are the clans. Particularly the Highland ones were living in a kind of bubble. They were too well fortified and too far away to make attacking them with any army worth it. They lived in semi-nomadic communities, completely separate from how we think about the rest of Scotland. They didn't have kings, they had chiefs, and often fought and formed alliances with each other. But just because they were separate didn't mean that they weren't powerful. They weren't cut off from technological development, so clans still had castles and swords and eventually guns, and they also had a lot of influence in regional economic power. The Highland clans were a distinct people separate from the rest of Scotland, kinda like how today Scots are distinct from the English despite both being British, although most Scots today don't actually think of themselves as British, but we haven't got there yet. The clan system had been in place for centuries. Sure, they'd been attacked before by outsiders like the other Scots, the English, the Irish, but the clan system held firm. As recently as 250 years ago, there was a distinct people and cultural group within Scotland, unique to not just Britain, but much of Europe as a whole. That was about to change. In 1691, all Scottish clans were called upon to swear allegiance to the new royal couple. The chief of each clan had until the 1st of January the next year to provide a signed document swearing allegiance to William and Mary. There were some rebellions, but many were willing to sign for the sake of peace. One of these was Clan MacDonald, but there was a problem. The MacDonalds had already sworn allegiance to James VII before he was deposed, and they had to ask if they could break that oath first. Communication during this time was slow, especially in the Highlands, and it wasn't until days before the deadline when the former king's message arrived, giving the MacDonalds approval. On his way to deliver the oath, the clan chief was held up by a rival clan, the Campbells, so he was a couple of days late by the time he actually got there to give the oath to the Scottish Secretary of State. He was a bastard, thinking of most Highlanders as savage barbarians, and he also particularly hated the MacDonalds. Despite them pledging their allegiance to the new monarchs, because it was a few days late, the secretary rejected their claim. What a dick. Worse still, the clan chief had no idea. He thought he just secured peace for his people. Meanwhile, the Secretary of State was arranging to make an example out of them. So in late winter 1692, when a small army under the command of Robert Campbell came, asking the MacDonalds for shelter to brace against the harsh storm, they accepted. For almost 2 weeks, the clanspeople shared their homes with the army. They shared their food, their shelter, they joked, they played games. It was all very wholesome. Until it wasn't. On the 13th of February, a blizzard swept over Glencoe, where the clanspeople were living, and the soldiers received new orders. They acted like nothing had changed. They continued playing cards, they bid their hosts goodnight, and waited until they slept. Nearly 40 clansmen were killed in the massacre, some still in their beds, and of the women and children who did manage to get away, they were left to freeze in the cold of the harsh Highland winter, with the only warmth available to them being their houses, which were now on fire. Even by the standards of Scottish history, this was one of its darkest chapters. Even at the time, people were outraged all over the British Isles. Their women's shriek was heard in vain, nor infancy's unpitied plain, more than the warrior's groan could gain, respite from ruthless butchery. The winter wind that whistled shrill, the snows that night that cloaked the hill, though wild and pitiless had still far more than southern clemency.
The breach of hospitality was a truly, truly despicable thing. It's still in our conscious memory, obviously, because I'm telling you about it. Just wrong on so many levels. Just no. Nothing lives there. You can go and visit Glencoe if you want, but it is a haunted place. You can actually feel it. It does look beautiful, but it is rather eerie there.
It's the 1690s, and by now, colonialism was in full swing. The Lowlanders, ever wanting to emulate the English, were getting jealous of their colonies. They too wanted to settle America, and so sent 20% of lowland wealth on a ship for Panama. And like our recent football campaigns, it was a disaster. There's a few reasons why New Caledonia failed. Firstly, Scotland was late to the party, and neither the English, Dutch or Spanish wanted another competitor in the region. And so they set about making sure there wouldn't be one, particularly England, which is kind of a given, but it was actually the Spanish military turning up that was the final nail in the coffin. Secondly, the Scots themselves weren't really prepared for the climate of Central America. Scotland is cold, Panama is not, and most of what the Scots brought with them just wasn't suited to the environment. The locals weren't going to trade if all they were being offered was these guys. Do you want to go to Panama? Panama? Thirdly, the whole thing was poorly planned from the beginning. Sending 20% of lowland wealth was incredibly stupid. The lowlands were, and still are, the centre for Scottish economic power. So chucking a fifth of their resources on a boat set for a journey an ocean away was incredibly careless. Lowlanders, am I right?
You're a fucking omni-shambles, that's what you are. You're like that coffee machine, you know, from bean to cup, you fuck up.
The chances of reaching America in the first place were far from guaranteed. This was the 1600s, ships were lost in storms all of the time. And supposedly once they did manage to reach the New World, the leadership and planning didn't get much better. Long story short, the colony completely failed and now Scotland was broke. So the English Parliament offered the Scots a deal. From England's perspective, having one crown uniting two countries was only causing headaches. It would have been far easier for everyone if the two countries just became one. Plus then it would mean that England wouldn't have to worry about wars with Scotland anymore. Wars which they mostly started, but still. Despite recently having come out of a famine and losing 1/5 of all their wealth, all Scottish people were against the idea of a union. But this is the early 1700s, democracy isn't a thing, so who cares? England didn't have to convince the Scottish people, they just had to convince the Scottish Parliament. And how were they going to do that? Oh, they just bribed everybody. Yeah. With their pockets lined with English money, the parcel of rogues set alight, metaphorically, to the Declaration of Arbroath. Scottish sovereignty was no more and it was incorporated into the new United Kingdom of Great Britain. Of course it wasn't united at all, and a lot of people were really angry about this. Rioting spread out across the entire country, and in areas of the Highlands, this rioting led to full-scale rebellion. When the Acts of Union went through the Scottish Parliament, opposition was formed with petitions from shires, boroughs, presbyterians and parishes. Not one petition in favour of the Union was received by Parliament. With all of the civil unrest, martial law was declared, and as for the Highland rebels, or Jacobites, they were now not only fighting for the restoration of the Stuarts, but also for Scottish independence. And speaking of the clans, the Jacobites fought against the British Army for decades following the Acts of Union. The Highlands and Lowlands were almost separate countries by this point, although the Lowlands were far more powerful. Being cucks to England will do that. You can tell which one I fall into, can't you? However, following the Acts of Union, a lot of Lowlanders moved up north to fight for the army behind independence. This divide between the two groups came to a head at the Battle of Culloden, the battle which effectively ended the Scottish clan system. During the battle, the Jacobites were completely wiped out, and in the aftermath, the clan system was dismantled. Clan chiefs had their land confiscated, and many Highlanders were forced into the British Army, exiled or executed. Even wearing tartan was made illegal.
You there, sir? I certainly hope you've got
tartan.
Well, no, I don't, but... Oh, no? Have you got...
The British sought to completely destroy Highland culture so there never again would be a rebellion against the monarchy. From the 1750s there were the Highland clearances. Clansmen were forced to move away from their homes and forced to move into the lowlands. The Scots' distinct group of clans with their own way of life were no more. And aye, a lot of people did starve as a result of this. At the start of the 18th century, around 30% of Scots lived in the Highlands and Islands. By the turn of the 20th century, this figure was just 8%. With their land confiscated, their houses burned down, and even their way of dress being outlawed, many Scots left the country altogether. Many went to North America in the newly fangled 13 colonies, which was a contributing factor to their anti-British sentiment over there, and well, we all know how that turned out. This is why so many of you Yanks have Scottish ancestry. You're descended from evicted clanspeople. Congrats! So the UK was here to stay, and Unionists didn't want to think of themselves as Scottish anymore. They were Northern British.
You serious?
It was actually mostly Scottish Unionists who pushed for the British identity, which up until now just wasn't a thing. Rule Britannia, for example, was written by a Scotsman, with the music later being adapted by an Englishman. For a few decades, the Scottish national identity faded further as time marched on, as being Northern British looked more and more like the former nation's new destiny. Some, however, were less willing to give up on Scotland. Robert Burns is Scotland's national poet. Think of him as our Shakespeare. He's even got a special holiday. Incidentally, why isn't Shakespeare Night a thing in England where you drink mead and eat Yorkshire puddings or whatever it is you guys do? You should do that, it'd be fun. Burns' poems frequently mention Scotland and Wallace and Bruce. Ironically though, the fact that most of Scotland's cultural exports were now in English actually helped put Scotland further on the map. Which did come with a cost to the death of Scots and Gaelic, but swings and roundabouts, innit? Walter Scott is another literary icon from this period, whose writings were popular across all of Europe. His work, Waverley, is largely credited as being the first historical novel, and it basically turned him into the superstar of his day, bringing Scottishness along with him. In the 1820s, European Romanticism was in full swing and people were starting to get nostalgic for Scotland of old. In a visit to Scotland, King George IV wore a tartan kilt, and everything went nuts. For the first time in a century, Scottish dress was allowed back in fashion, and people even took an interest in the clansmen. Each clan had a particular pattern that they wore, and so people who wanted in on the fashion craze started looking into their...
Hang on. Oh.
their ancestry to see what pattern was their pattern. Although it did come close to losing its identity, Scotland cemented itself as a country within the UK, rather than being Northern Britain. Seriously, Northern Britain? On the one hand, Scotland was the victim of colonialism, the Highland clearances, the suppression of the Jacobites, bribing the Scottish Parliament into non-existence. However, there's no getting around the fact that the British Empire was incredibly beneficial to Scotland, and the Union was formed at basically the perfect time. Not long after the Acts of Union in 1707, the Industrial Revolution started in England, and in 1778 the Scotsman James Watt, as in the measurement, invented his steam engine, and then it all went crazy. Although today the most famous universities in Britain are Oxford and Cambridge, back in the 1800s they were Edinburgh and Glasgow. This is why so many modern inventions we use today were made by Scottish people. By the way, if you've seen this list and you've gone, Northern Britain? On the one hand, Scotland was the victim of colonialism, the Highland clearances, the suppression of the Jacobites, bribing the Scottish Parliament into non-existence. However, there's no getting around the fact that the British Empire was incredibly beneficial to Scotland, and the Union was formed at basically the perfect time. Not long after the Acts of Union in 1707, the Industrial Revolution started in England, and in 1778 the Scotsman James Watt, as in the measurement, invented his steam engine, and then it all went crazy. Although today the most famous universities in Britain are Oxford and Cambridge, back in the 1800s they were Edinburgh and Glasgow. This is why so many modern inventions we use today were made by Scottish people. By the way, if you've seen this list and you've gone,
excuse me, yes, a Scotsman founded the US Navy. Take that, you Dutch.
what the fuck? Bonus video on Patreon. We're gonna go for it together. Give me a week or two. There's actually a lot of bonus videos on there, and it's only £1.50 a month. £1.50 a month? What a bargain! For much of the 1800s, Edinburgh was the global centre for medical science, and it's thanks to these physicians that British hospitals stopped being death traps and actually started helping people. There's also some crazy stories to do with body snatching, but we really haven't got time. All of Scotland's innovations, combined with open trade with England, brought Scotland a lot of wealth during this period. Its major cities rapidly expanded, and most of Edinburgh and Glasgow's centres became famed for their architecture, most of which survives today. Have you seen how beautiful Edinburgh is? It's fucking outrageous. Let's not forget though that a lot of this wealth and prosperity came from ransacking other cultures, mainly India and Africa. A lot of Scottish nationalists like to entirely blame Britain's atrocities on England, and sure, it was mainly England who called the shots throughout all of this, but Scotland did benefit from the Empire, and most Scottish people were perfectly fine with that at the time. Although Scotland wasn't sovereign anymore, by being a part of the UK, it was part of the biggest empire the world has ever seen, and unlike in Ireland or, heaven forbid, India, Scottish people were, mostly, treated as equals to the English. Scotland might have been a minority in the Westminster Parliament, but at least they were there. Ireland didn't have that until 1801, and other colonies never got included at all, so that's something. Had Scotland not joined the UK, it almost certainly would be weaker today because of it. The thing is though, back in the days of Empire, Scotland got something out of it, but the Empire didn't last forever, and when the Empire fell, Scotland fell with it. Before we really get into the fall of the Empire, we need to talk about some of the divides in Scotland around this time. The Highlanders and Lowlanders naturally still hated each other, and this was largely still felt along religious lines as well. Mainly Catholics versus Protestants. Naturally, the still Catholic Highlanders found affinity with the Irish, who'd also had their sovereignty and culture decimated by the British Army, whereas the Protestant Lowlanders felt closer to their English neighbours over the border. By no coincidence at all, in the last election in 2024, the SNP found most of its support in the Highlands, whereas the Conservative Party found most of its support in the borders. I wonder why.
Okay, I think we'll stop it there, actually. Because I really, really need to get to my bed now. Dear God, have to. Yeah, if I'm going to be fresh-faced in peak annoying mode for Kev and Christy tomorrow, or today, my God. 21 hours. So, away to bed for me. I'm glad you all raided in. It was fun. We will get to the rest of this. I will start. Let's see, how much have I got left? I've got an hour left. So, I'm going to have to do this for super hubbies a week. I will start at about 9:30 to 10 so we can get through the rest of this video. Then we can chat for a bit, then read into Kev. Okay, so watch out. I'll say when I start, so probably 9:30, probably maybe 10. Okay, glad you all could make it. And I'll see you all tomorrow night. Bye.